research seminars. One of the things that we missed while we were on sabbatical last year was really interesting and varied kinds of programs we have at these weekly seminars. So we're delighted to be back and to be part of it again. We have some really good people lined up for our seminar series this year. John Durham Peters is going to be here from the University of Iowa. Klaus Krippendorf from the University of Pennsylvania. Jan Radway from Northwestern. Ellen Wartella from Northwestern as well. And we have, of course, a couple of our own people who are speaking, including Paolo today, and Chris Smith, who will be speaking next week. So lots of good people in mind. If you have suggestions for other people, most of this semester is already filled up. If there's somebody who you think you'd like to see come visit us, whether you're a grad student or a faculty member or a staff member, by all means, let us know who that person is, and we'll do our best to try to get them to come here and give a talk, probably in the spring semester. So Larry and I have been organizing this year's seminars together, and I want to thank him for taking over last year, getting everything so well organized. And he's going to introduce our speaker today. So, Larry.
I've got a lead. Well, this is a really nice occasion on several dimensions. As Peter said, it's always really very good when we can have one of our own speak to us, a member of our own community. This is also, however, a little more than that for many of you, for doctoral students here. Paolo can serve as a role model. Paolo did his initial studies in Italy. You have probably figured out that he's Italian. You will when he starts speaking. Studied economics. Came to USC, where he received an MBA, as you can see, from the Marshall School. Also studied business of entertainment at the Cinema School, and enrolled in our doctoral program, from which he graduated 2 years ago. But also very relevant to his talk today, which is based on his dissertation research, is that the dissertation is already in press and will momentarily appear as a book. That's the role model part. And you may want to talk to Paolo later on, because he's here, and you can find him and talk to him about the challenging process of turning your dissertation into a book. But I'm really very delighted that he was able to do it in very good time. And I'm looking forward to seeing the book, but we are all now looking forward to hearing about it. I won't take up his time by reading his title, but I'm sure we will all be illuminated in the next hour.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the invitation and for kind of more introduction. So the talk is going to be about interdisciplinary approaches in the analysis of the evolution of the media sphere. So different strands of inquiry have focused on the global media sphere. They have analyzed the international flow of content, media, and content across national and cultural borders. And they have utilized different theoretical frameworks as the phenomenon has an economic value, a political value, or cultural value. So fields of studies from cultural studies, economics, international relations have analyzed different themes in this contested media space. One of these themes is Hollywood's role in all this. So Hollywood's leadership as a global leader. As you know, we are just located in San Francisco, where the 6 Hollywood studios are headquartered and been so for the last decades. So my analytical entry point is the study of economics. So I start with specifically industrial economics. So I will analyze Hollywood's role and Hollywood's leadership, analyzing the drivers of its competitive advantage domestically and internationally. But my hope is that this research can connect above and beyond the field of economics and connect to the other fields of studies, like of the study media study, film studies that have analyzed Hollywood. So, what is the digital glocalization of entertainment? It's a term that tries to capture an evolving and more relevant phenomenon within the global media sphere, which is composed of two different parts. One is glocalization, which is, simply put, the process of adapting global offerings to meet local needs and culturally situated customers, audiences, and so forth. A particularly unusual business practice in the last 20 or 30 years in the United States, when American companies, but also transnational companies worldwide, try to penetrate different markets, they would adapt their offerings to local needs. So, for example, in consumer products, giants like Procter & Gamble, headquartered here in Cincinnati, or Lever, their company, would create products for the domestic market and then adapt them globally. So, Mr. Clean in the United States becomes Don Limpio in Spanish speaking country, and Mr. Pop in French speaking country, Mascolindo in England. But this phenomenon had marginal impact in the entertainment business, in that there were very few entities outside of the Hollywood studios that would truly be global, meaning they would reach all the different countries across the globe. There being transnational entities operating above and beyond their cultural domestic market, but very few actually were truly global. And they couldn't engage too much into this phenomenon of localization, which is, adapting locally. So this is one element. And the second one being digital. So we are witnessing the ICT revolution, information communication technology revolution, unfolding in many sectors of society and the business, including the entertainment. And it shows signs of being a disruptive technology, changing and altering the status quo of existing technology. Now, this is not the first disruptive technology that has had an impact on the business of entertainment in Hollywood in particular. So if you go back, sound in the 20s was actually a pretty disruptive technology as it changed the landscape. And, it was initially opposed by certain elements of Hollywood and embraced by others. For example, Warner Brothers distributed the first talking picture, the Talkie, in 1927, the jazz sequel, and they became a major player as a result of their embracing technology at the time, so in the 20s. If we fast forward to the 40s, when TV came along, that too was a disruptive technology for Hollywood, as it created the possibility of home entertainment for the first time with visual images. And same thing took place, for example, in the 80s when the video recording devices were made available by consumer electronics giants. And that too had a major impact on the dynamics of the sector. Now, Hollywood, even though they fiercely opposed most all of this technology, especially TV at the beginning and the VCR in the 80s, they emerge actually even stronger as a result of this disruptive technology. Under the assumption, usually this is referred to as content is king, because they own copyright of the content, and so these different technologies only provided multiple platforms for their products. Now, the question is the ICT the same thing? Will the ICT be the same thing, meaning it's another destructive technology which will eventually increase Hollywood's dominance and primacy globally? So we will see. And this research tries to analyze this and dissect the different dimensions of this technology. It is a new technology in that it has an impact on multiple levels of this industry. So on the one hand, on the content, just like sound. But on the other, on the delivery platforms, making available multiple delivery platforms through internet-based protocol devices, so mobile, on-the-go, and computers. But also on the business models, which have been regulated in this industry for decades. So it used to be that the studio would take complete advantage of the properties of this goods, which are experience goods, to be non-excludable in consumption, to be repeatedly proposed to the same audiences or different audiences, and generating multiple revenue streams in the process. In fact, with these two technologies like TV and home video, technology now provide some of the most interesting revenue streams for the Hollywood studios. There are signs that through unauthorized utilization of content and so forth, the user-generated content and so forth, that this might not be the case for this revolution. Now, it is also, as mentioned kindly by Professor Gross, the title of a book. So, which will be very expensive, which will be much to my surprise, which will be released in the next weeks. And here they clearly indicate what the book is about. So it tries to analyze two trajectories, institutional trajectories altering the business. And these are, on the one hand, non-scripted entertainment. We'll talk about this in a couple of slides. So shows such as reality TV shows and so forth. And the ICT revolution. And the argument is that actually this time there seems to be potential for altering the existing dynamics within the industry. In order to do so, as said, my intellectual entry point is from the field of economics, from industrial economics. So I initially studied this sector as if it were just like any other sector. Try to figure out who the leaders are and what are what are the forces operating in this industry. So this is a framework from Porter, Professor at Harvard. He identifies 5 forces to assess an industry. Again, any industry. And these forces are, on the one hand, what's at the center, who are the leaders, what's their strategy, what is it that they do. And they are the Hollywood studios. In film entertainment, they are indeed have been the leaders in the United States for decades. And actually, in total, they usually, in the last 20 years, they usually have something like 70-80% of the domestic box office. And what they do not compete on cost reduction, but they compete on differentiation. And each movie is a new venture, is a new project, and so imagine how risky that activity is. And they try to minimize the risk by having a diversified portfolio. They usually release some 20 movies each year in their slate. And they also try to bet on the right projects, usually relying on sequels, prequels, or something before they work. Now, things have changed dramatically since the 20s. The Hollywood studios would diminish their risk associated with their activities by being vertically integrated back then. So they were content producers, distributors, and exhibitors, because they also own movie theaters. This is no longer the case since 1948, so they need to reduce their risk by being part of large conglomerates and try to diversify their offer. The threats from new entrants, so what you see on the left-hand side, seem to be a little bit low. At least they've been so in the last decades, in that it's a very capital-intensive business. So just to on average, to produce a movie, distribute this movie in the United States, it costs some $100 million. So $70 million to $70 million to produce the first copy of this of the movie, the official motion picture, and $35 million to distribute it, including marketing costs, promotion costs, and prints, which will eventually diminish as the digital revolution will include also the distribution. So if you think about it, just one movie on average costs $100 million. Imagine this times 20, because usually that's the slate the studios have. So it creates barriers to entry for newcomers. It's very difficult to enter this business, and when you do so, you compete with this giant. So very few entities have, on the one hand, the financial capacity to do so, and on the other, the know-how to do so effectively. And Hollywood studios have been doing so for decades. On the other side, so your right-hand side, so far they've been somewhat medium threat from subsidies. So products that would try to cater to the same needs that, let's say, visual motion pictures or TV series would do, like theme parks, sports, and so forth. And Hollywood studios over the years have understood that they are part of the entertainment business and no longer solely on the movie business, and then expanded to include in their operations also this kind of things, or most of these things. The other two forces that, according to this paradigm, we need to analyze are the forces from the suppliers, and so content creators, and they tend to be, on average, low, in that even if a handful of individuals can command like $20+ billion per movie, usually the category is not as powerful as the studios are. And we see that over and over again, studios replacing actors, TV series. Charlie Sheen, the most paid TV actor in 2.5 Men, was just replaced. Even though obviously they have deals protecting their rights, so it is a somewhat dynamic relation. And on the offer side, the packages, so the Hollywood studios operate in a business-to-business environment, so they sell not necessarily directly to consumers, but through other entities, and they seem to be also with media bargaining power in that, under the assumption, again, that at least in the last 20 years, content was king. So that seems to give us insight, to shed some light on the domestic side. So the Hollywood studios have been the leaders in the US. And to translate that into a global environment, there is another tool that I will utilize, again, from the very same scholar, which is the National Diamond Theoretical Framework, which is an interesting theoretical tool that analyzes competitive advantage for industries that share geographical proximity and also intense competition. So being within the same region, having competition actually seems to give them a competitive advantage globally. This is not the only case where that is actually happening. Think about the fashion industry with poles like Paris, Milan, and so forth, with the consumer electronics giants located in Japan and so forth. Not to mention that oftentimes this geographical proximity is centered or revolves around academic institutions or research bodies. And that is the case of, obviously, Silicon Valley and Route 128 around Boston, and the Research Triangle in Carolina, and so forth. So there is a reason why there is a competitive advantage, and this reason has to do with a combination of factors, of determinants. And this theoretical framework identifies 4 factors that would explicate why, for example, Hollywood had a global competitive advantage in the last decades. So the first one connects to the other theoretical framework, which is the demand condition. So we noticed, and in my research, I provide data of all these market positions. So the Hollywood studios have been dominating the domestic market in the US. Usually around 80% of box office goes into distribution, goes for product distributed by Hollywood studios. So to have access to the largest demand in the world in economic terms gives them a competitive advantage. So to be the leaders in the biggest market in the world, biggest, again, in economic terms, not in terms of output, because as you know, Hollywood is not the most prolific industry. Bollywood, so the Indian industry and Nigerian industry are. But it is in economic terms, so in economic value generated by the box office in the United States, it is roughly $10 billion per year. So to be the leader in such a sophisticated and rich market gives them a competitive advantage in and of itself. So when they compete overseas, for example, a Hollywood movie has a higher production value compared to, let's say, Poland. So when a Hollywood blockbuster competes in Poland or in Norway, they compete with local products which cannot have access to these resources because the market is so much smaller. And that creates actually a virtuous cycle. So the more this is the case, the more Hollywood studios have access not only to the largest domestic market, but to a global market. So that creates even more resources to be invested in a feature-length motion picture. That is why we notice it's almost $100 million. No other entities in the world can do something similar to that. So that in itself creates one competitive advantage. The other factors might fall into the category of factor conditions. So one is, again, being in close proximity with research institutions, in particular film schools. So I insert, of course, USC, but also others here, like CalArts, American Film Institute, and so forth. They attract talent from all over the world. willing to, hoping to break into the industry. And in so doing, they create another mechanism that helps this virtuous competitive advantage mechanism between the factors. Not to mention that, as we all know and enjoy, this region has weather condition that enables production all over. It was one of the drivers, the original drivers for the then independent producer and exhibitors to move from the East Coast to the West Coast with Warner Brothers and so on. So these are two factors. And another factor is that the strategy, structure, and rivalry of this industry actually makes the product better. So being in competition and aggressively competing for talent creates a mechanism which is similar to the fashion industry, consumer electronics, and so forth. So the end result of this is a better product. Not to mention that, and this is the fourth and last element of this dimension, there are relating and supporting industries within this town, such as the music industry. So 3 out of 4 giants in the music industry are also headquartered here in Southern California, TV industry, talent agencies, and so forth. So in other words, this theoretical framework helps us explicate why is it that from a domestic competitive advantage, Hollywood studios have been enjoying a global competitive advantage. Again, all these factors were in place. So that took place and can help us understand what just happened in the last decades. But something new is happening. So as mentioned, there is the information communication technology evolution on one hand, and on the other hand, the phenomenon of glocalization. So entities that more and more try to adapt their offering, like Hollywood studios, to local needs. I'll give you one example. Any Big Brother fans? Its 13th season. It's one example of non-scripted entertainment or reality TV shows. You know, in scholarly conversation, the term reality TV is considered a misnomer, and rightly so, in that what we see on this show has very little to do with real, as it undergoes major editing processes, casting unrealistic situations, and so forth. The genre is not new, actually. So the genre of non-scripted entertainment can be traced back since the origin of TV in the United States, such as game shows and so forth, which were very popular in the 40s. And then something happened and they completely declined. And they abandoned the prime time slots. And what happened was that it turned out that some of these shows were rigged. And so, obviously, the authenticity at the core of this, in attracting individuals to see these shows. And so they disappear somewhat in the daytime. They never cease to exist. So there's no scripted entertainment, so entertainment that doesn't follow a script, as opposed to scripted TV series, shows and motions, pictures, and so forth. But they resurfaced some 10 years ago, and at least in prime time in the United States. Even though, again, they never left the American schedules. If you think about, for example, the real world of MTV, which is from the 90s, actually very clearly, the producer clearly stated that he drew on American Family. PBS show, very influential back then. So these shows never left, and they were actually adopted later in primetime shows. What I use in this research the term, again, no scripted entertainment as opposed to reality TV show, because it's a little bit larger, and it includes game shows and all this kind of different shows which follow scripts. In other conversations, they usually refer to as factual entertainment. For example, in the UK, that's the term utilized. And here in Hollywood, interestingly enough, it's called alternative program. So if you are the head of reality shows for a major network or for a talent agency, you're, let's say, VP of alternative program. These shows, though, have, in addition of this characteristic, have another interesting dimension, is that they're not American shows. I mean, they're not owned by American entities. So Big Brother, for example, is owned by an entity called Endemol, which is from the Netherlands. It's a European company. Its odd name comes from the combination of the two original producers, Mr. Annenberg and Mr. De Wolf. And they launched Big Brother in 1999 in the Netherlands. And they quickly was distributed globally, including the United States. For a lot of reasons, one being that actually, I don't know if you remember, sometimes these things happen in the Hollywood environment, is that there were major changes, there were strikes from the Screen Actor Guild. And so networks decided to utilize, in summary, these new formats as a temporary solution to a problem. Actually, these shows ended up working quite well. So as we will see in a couple of slides, they are actually a stable feature in the schedules in the US and worldwide. We will see that in prime time now we have like at least one no-scripted entertainment show every day of the week. And that's unprecedented. Only 10 years ago, with the exception probably of Monday Night Football, there were no program like this in prime time. So what happens here is that this is not an isolated case, in other words. So we have Big Brother, which actually turned out not to be so successful here in the US as opposed to, let's say, Survivor, another reality show from Europe, or Dancing with the Stars. Dancing with the Stars from the BBC, so an established player. Whereas, Annenberg is a relatively new player here from Europe. But the top shows in the United States, in terms of audience, in the last 5 years, were two shows like this. So one is American Idol, which I like the name suggests is not an American show, it's an American adaptation of Pop Idol, which is a show owned by Fremantle, a UK company, owned by, within the Bertelsmann Group in Germany. And the second one is Dancing with the Stars, which is again from the BBC. So you see, these are European entities that have created shows that are extremely adapted or adaptable locally, to the extent that Big Brother has been adapted in nearly 70 countries. And there are many reasons for that. So Europe too had a history of shows like this. And like Eurofestival. Heard of Eurofestival, the competition where different singers from each country of Europe would compete to get the most, to receive this Eurofestival award. And were quite strong in the 70s, so the ABBA, for example, originated or reached European popularity by winning this contest. Or other shows like Jeux Sans Frontières, Games Without Frontiers, which is similar to what we see in Wipeout, so we're competing live to have different teams for different countries. So in other words, in Europe there seemed to be like a dimension like this, where these formats would draw on. What happens, in addition to these local adaptations, these shows seem to lend themselves better to a digital dimension by having new platforms, interactivity with the audience. Audiences can decide who wins, who stays, so they can vote like in American Idol and so forth. So if you're watching Big Brother, that's what happens. So this show is presented in the edited version in prime time, but you might have access to this through cable channels, after dark editions, and so forth. We can vote, we can interact with the contestants, and so forth. And this has particular value also in economic terms, because they lend themselves also to have marketing communication within their plots. So this is one example of glocalization and digital glocalization, that they seem to be able to capture value generated by the properties in a way that is unthinkable or impossible by scripted entertainment. In that, again, they lend themselves to interactivity and platforms and so forth to consume interactively. So this is one example of digital glocalization of entertainment. And I want to show you another example, which is, as the Olympics are approaching again. In a way, the TV coverage of the Olympic Games has a similar path, in that it's a global event, one of the few truly global sports events. The others, the FIFA Soccer World Cup probably attracting similar numbers, but the other sports do not seem to be as global as these two events. So unfortunately for the US, for instance, the NFL is not a global sport, so outside of, nor is baseball. It's transnational to a certain extent, in that it reaches Japan, Central Central American, but they're not actually global sites. Obviously, the Olympic Games are, and they've been televised, and they've been a media event at least until the 1960s, for the Olympic Games in Rome, where they were for the first time televised to multiple countries. And the fees have grown exponentially because they turn out to be an incredibly powerful way to communicate with audiences. So what's happening is that this too is somewhat adapted by local broadcasters. And for example, NBC in the United States, of course, they introduce global events, just like Michael Phelps or Usain Bolt's performances, but also very specifically local events, just like beach volley, where the athletes compete. This is happening throughout the world. So if you watch the German broadcasters, they tend to focus on German athletes and so forth. So there is a process of adaptation of a global event to the local needs of audiences. And they also seem to be taking advantage in an unprecedented way of the possibilities provided by the digital dimension. Particularly in the 2008 Olympic Games, there were 3,600 hours of programming, a lot of different networks were involved, and for the first time there were more than 2,000 hours of streaming video. So the content could be accessed through their portal to allow viewing at home, in the office, and on the go. And so what they had global content, so like the inaugural ceremony, for example, but also local content, so their own athletes competing. And as we approach 2012, 40 days ago, they seem to be following the very same path. So they seem to be approaching the event by providing events on air, online, on the go. In other words, try to capture all the possibilities that this event might give in economic terms. So, why does this matter? And how does that connect to the original slides, where we try to analyze Hollywood's competitive advantage? Is that there is a new paradigm where more and more global events, global formats, they are adapted locally. And the digital dimension is increasingly important. So not to capture this element would decrease the competitive advantage. Just as mentioned earlier, I wanted to show you what is happening here. So this is the schedule of, courtesy of Variety, of the mega networks for fall, this Afghanistan. And you will see that at least one of these shows can fall into this category. So it's Dancing with the Stars on Monday, Not to Mention the Scene, off, and on Tuesday we have Dancing with the Stars again, The Biggest Loser. Wednesday we have the X Factor, which will be another of these shows originating from Europe, Survivor, and so forth. X Factor again on Thursday, Extreme Makeover, another reality show from the very same entity. So again, these things would be unthinkable 15 years ago. So if we and actually check all the schedules in the last 15 years, and you'll see that there's a dramatic change in the last few years when these shows enter the landscape and prove to be successful. And that has an impact on what we were talking about earlier. So has an impact on the demand condition, in that if Hollywood studios are no longer able to capture a larger share of their domestic market, they will have a less high production value when they compete internationally. And this is happening at least in the TV sector. So this is something that it is happening. On the other hand, I mentioned that many strands of inquiry have analyzed these international flows of content and tried to figure out and explicate why Hollywood had a competitive advantage. So just like looking at the text, dissecting the text, as in the case of Dallas, for example, and so forth, and different theoretical frameworks have been set forth. So how Hollywood production have narrative transparency, for example, or they have universality, primordiality, and they are polysemic in nature, that they speak, they have a semiotic access, they speak to different audiences. And one can make an argument that these shows, whether we like them or not, do have also these dimensions, in that local adaptations tend to resonate very well with local audiences. People are not even aware they're watching a foreign format. Because if you watch American Idol, contestants are from the United States and judges are mostly from the United States. So we don't have that kind of differences that we might encounter when we have access to foreign-generated entertainment. So that seems to be a new paradigm which has the potential of altering existing balances between, especially Hollywood's global competitive advantage. Of course, it will depend how Hollywood reacts to the digital dimensions of the changes brought in by the information communication technology. And as we've seen, they might have thought it initially, as was the case for TV and home video, but then they turn out to be actually become even stronger as a result of this technology. Will this happen? The theoretical position that I had in this research, throughout the research when it comes to technological change, draws on Williams' approach on his book on TV, where it's not technological determinism, and what happens actually is the end result of societal forces, which include populated entities, in other words, studios that might react, governmental regulations, locally situated audiences, and so forth. So it is soon to see what is about to happen, but this is, in my view, a major change that has the potential. Again, this combination of these two unrelated trajectories. So on one hand, the change of genre, so non-scripted entertainment as opposed to scripted entertainment, which lend themselves to be locally adapted. On the other, this major technological change that has an impact on multiple dimensions, which is content, digital distribution, and business models. They do indeed have the potential of altering existing competitive advantages. And so that's the end of my presentation. I'll be delighted to answer any question you might have or any curiosity that you might have about it. Of course, this is, again, I presented just a conceptual dimension of this research, and the book will have data and be more clearly explicated. I just did, and all the references, as you can imagine, I tap into different theoretical frameworks, and I try to precisely get these contributions. So thank you very much for your attention.
One question related to the Olympics concerning the TV ratings, for example, for Beijing, pretty terrible, partly due to the fact that the time zone difference was so severe, and what was being shown on prime time in the U.S. was really worthless when you were able to catch that through a social network or through an online medium. And so how, something temporal, which you can't control, how does a factor like that then play into a model?
It does. I think it's a great question. That especially here in the United States, due to how large this country is and the different time zones, so within the continental United States, so 3 hours difference between the major markets. The first one, New York, second one, Los Angeles. Very rarely do sports events appear broadcasted live, which is absolutely the case, I would say, all over the world. So here in the United States, there's a little bit of concern of showing the live events in the first place. And even for sports events, that is not usually the case. And I agree with you that in this day and age, you don't capture the value. What drives people to watch these shows is to figure out the results. So once the results are known through the internet and so forth, there's less motivation to watch the show. So I understand they know this. I had the pleasure to interview a couple of senior executives for this project. So they're aware of this phenomenon. But it's very difficult to manage that. The bulk of their resources are from advertising the primetime shows. And they're afraid to cannibalize that by offering too much content online. So they have to strike the right balance between live offering and tape relate. But I completely agree that when it comes to non-scripted entertainment, one can make an argument that sports are the ultimate non-scripted entertainment shows. It's the result that drives people to watch or not watch.
This was mostly a Western and Northern kind of phenomenon, the way you described the blocks and the globalization forces. Why isn't Asia involved in this? And is it just, I've seen Japanese reality TV shows and they're just different.
And one has been adapted like the Iron Chef, that's from Fuji Television, absolutely. So it is happening. And to a certain extent, I don't know if you remember, it just lasted 1 year. I survived a Japanese game show. It was actually an American reality show that introduced Wipeout, which also, from Annenberg, seems to mimic this damage, but with an extremely slow motion replay and excessive stunts.
Is there the same kind of cross penetration with Asia and the West?
But what happened is, and that is why, what I want to put it out, usually, scholarly conversation in cultural studies, for example, have the West against the West paradigm. Okay? Because when they point that out, so when they realize that there is a major trade imbalance when it comes to entertainment between the first world and all the other emerging markets. But also within the West and within the Atlantic corridor, so between the US and Europe, there have been a major imbalance where the exports from the US vastly exceed the import from Europe. What is happening now, why this is still the case, so exports from the US still exceed vastly so the imports, there is a kind of a reverse. All these shows tend to be from Europe. Now, when it comes to Asia, there are different realities. It's a contested media space, and there are different entities operating. They tend to have somewhat a more regional focus, but there are exceptions. So, feature-length motion pictures like Spirited Away from Japan was a major success worldwide. And they had this kind of shows, but the leaders at this moment, they tend to be from Europe. So this Endable I mentioned, well, these are like $1 billion revenue entities. And so is Fremantle, so is the BBC, so is another one called Zodiac. And they tend to be the distributors of all the shows, not only here in the United States, but worldwide. So I mentioned Big Brother has been distributed in 70 countries. So it seems to mimic like a typical Hollywood distribution that reach really all the available platforms worldwide. But nothing prevents Japanese companies, for example, to do so. Actually, the very term glocalization was utilized initially to analyze what Japanese companies were doing in the 80s as they were trying to enter the American markets and would adapt their offering, their consumer electronics sector to the American audiences. So they're very aware. One can make an argument that glocalization happens when probably you don't have access to a large domestic market, like this Dutch company, and so you have to adapt in order to be international. But nothing prevents Fuji Television from expanding, creating even more Iron Chefs, and trying to distribute it. Because now there seems to be an appetite for this kind of genre. Now, whether we like it or not, because as you can imagine from an aesthetic point of view, issues have been raised, and also from the dark side of the show. So I don't want to point a very optimistic picture about this show because they have a lot of flaws. But I was interested in figure now how these shows are altering the existing dynamics of the global media scene, in particularly Hollywood's production. Another thing is that Hollywood too is engaging in reality shows with these alternative programming divisions, and so they do have The Bachelor, Bachelorette, and so forth. Still, they do not seem to be the leaders in these entities. I just have to see to so at least from a market perspective. Yes.
Have you done any research into why certain reality shows are more popular in other countries, such as Big Brother's popular in Europe and Survivor in America?
Well, they usually, when except they are polled about this, they rely on the local adaptation. So what they say, there are three things that are central, which are casting, and casting. So these are the things that should work. So it relies on a very robust format on the one hand, but on local adaptations on the other. So because you have to create interesting phenomena out of the ordinary, and you do so by combining massive different visuals, as in the case of Survivor, Big Brother. Also, I've seen all the different, at least 10 different adaptations of Big Brother, and here it seems to be a little bit more, our alumna, Julie Chen has a more journalistic tone to it, as if we were dealing with a journalistic event. Whereas in other parts of the world, it's more entertainment. So things have a more, probably a lighter approach. But in other words, it's the local adaptation that counts. that ultimately makes or breaks the success of the show. And there are major things that you have to do, not only casting, but also editing. Imagine that what you see very early is live, but undergoes a major process of editing. So good editing can really modify the show as we watch it. Yes?
My question has to do with kind of like the homogenization of content in entertainment today, and as well as user-generated content, because like, for example, like with Big Brother, it's been adopted across the world essentially, but that kind of just shows there seems to be a lack of originality coming from the studio standpoint. And on the other side, you have YouTube or other, SoundCloud or Spotify, those different websites, like more cloud computing websites, that are really trying to gather, I guess, the wisdom of the crowd or the creativity of the crowd. And I was just wondering about your opinion on whether the big studios will actually try to poach talent from these new platforms to actually see if they can, elevate something from the local, from locality into something global.
They did. It's a great point. They did. I mean, they're scouting constantly from talent agencies to studio what's going on, user-generated content. I don't know if you ever seen a very low production budget like Fred. I don't know if you've heard of Fred. Fred Goes Swimming. It's a user-generated content by an individual who I believe is in his 20s. His name is not even Fred, and he acts as if, with an altered voice, he acts as an 8-year-old boy. And this is viral. If you go to YouTube, it's like 50 million hits. So what happened is, as a result of this mega phenomenon, Paramount did Freddy the movie. So poached this individual and made this movie, which I believe went straight to video or to
YouTube.
Yes, exactly. So actually, I watched the movie just to see what happened, and it's really hard to watch. I mean, it's really it's not the level that you would think for Paramount. Right. So I believe it's a very complex media space where feature-length motion pictures with A-list talent still exist and will exist for the foreseeable future. Will be globally distributed, but there are signs that user-generated content, as you correctly pointed out, and this non-scripted entertainment phenomenon, where Hollywood now has, from the substitutes side we talked about earlier, has more competitors, especially given that some production, the cost of production have been diminishing dramatically as a result of motion technology.
China and other places are making huge investments in developing their entertainment industry with an eye toward competing because they can tell stories in a local, indigenous sort of way. Do you see moves such as that as ultimately threatening?
They are. I mean, what is happening is China has been a sleeping giant in the entertainment for decades, and now they're opening up, even though they have quotas, so only 20 feature-length motion picture per year from overseas can enter China. But China has also a robust entertainment industry. They have, I understand, for example, the Hengtian studios, like a 5-hour drive from Shanghai, are state-of-the-art, and that's where Mission Impossible was shot, 3 was shot. And they're trying to do it, and they are backed by local government. It remains to be seen. I mean, it's a 1.3 billion people market. It remains to be seen if their stories will resonate with people outside of China. But in and of itself, the $1.3 billion market is incredibly relevant. What is happening, though, that, at least in my view, is that Chinese people seem to be developing an appetite for entertainment content developed in the Western world. And this is proven by the content flowing above and beyond these quotas through piracy. So an estimate of piracy in China of entertainment content exceeds like 90%, 95%. So it creates like potentially a long-term opportunity for those students. So they're not earning money as we speak, but it might create phenomenal cultivation in the long term. So you get familiar with stories from a completely different landscape, and that will eventually stimulate demand once and if they open up these entry barriers. But Hollywood studios have been trying to enter China for at least 15 years. Fox, most famously, but also Warner Brothers, they were exhibitors. They had a venture with local exhibitors. And the other countries, India, always talking about India, China and India, because they represent an incredibly large population. Another problem with China from a strictly economic point of view is that the market is a 1.3 billion people market. But in economic terms, the per capita income is vastly different, and only probably 10% of the population can have standards similar and can consume entertainment and pay for that, similar to what takes place in the Western world, which is still, 10% of 1.3 billion people is still relevant. But the key seems to be to unlock the other 90%. This is also true for India. So whoever is able to do so creates in itself a competitive advantage for the foreseeable future entertainment. But they seem to be avid consumers of Western entertainment, but on the other hand, they're trying with effective ways to actually develop themselves and position themselves as the new Hollywood. This is also happening in Thailand. It's happening obviously in Korea, that they're very interested in developing, not to mention Japan, of course. I already mentioned the Bollywood industry in India. So there are centers. I completely agree that China is potentially the next big thing. And I understand this studio that was mentioned earlier, is Hengdian Studios. They are part of a large conglomerate pharmaceutical company. They also invest in media, seems to be state-of-the-art, and is attracting a lot of runway productions from Hollywood. Because Hollywood, when we talk about Hollywood, we talk about a physical place, the district within the city of Los Angeles, but it's more a metaphor to indicate the entertainment industry operating in Southern California, even though they might finance movies that are shot by a British director in New Zealand and so forth. And so they try to attract first this runway production with tax incentives and so forth, and try to insert themselves in this jet stream, this flow of entertainment across the national borders.
I was trying to think of other genres that would be particularly suitable to globalization, and I'm having a little trouble with that, and also getting outside of television if you go to movies. And I started to think maybe about telenovelas, but I wonder what other genres.
It's a great point. From feature-length motion picture, it's very difficult. What happens is that it's the genre within the film that usually travels better overseas. For example, it's a well-known fact from Indian circles that the drama series, action movies travel better than comedy series because they encounter locally situated audiences, and so it's very difficult to create something like this in scripted entertainment, especially when it comes to feature-length motion pictures. And I agree that the feature-length motion pictures lend themselves far less to a local adaptation. When it comes to scripted entertainment, it's been done in the past. It's like telenovelas, as you mentioned. Ugly Betty is an adaptation. Yo Soy de la Fea, Colombian telenovelas, and so is The Office, which is an adaptation from the UK. So it can be done. Actually, The Office is an interesting example in that its success vastly exceeds the original series from the UK. It lasted only 2 series, whereas the other one is still going on. It's in the 10th season, I believe. And actually, it's been a phenomenon of reverse in that the American version of The Office is now being shown also in the UK. But I agree. So they seem to be, when it's something non-scripted, I believe they lend themselves for the open narrative to globalization far better than scripted, even though it is possible. But absolutely, I think it's visual motion pictures are more difficult too.
Yeah, actually along the same lines, you really haven't mentioned music once, except briefly when you talked about the Euro and games, which
Absolutely.
One is told are becoming a significant part of the landscape. Do they fit here in the same?
Absolutely. I mean, the focus of this research was limited to this phenomenon, but I absolutely agree that when it comes to the games industry, they have reached the level of theatrical dimension in the United States, and when it comes to music, it's been done for decades. So that the 4 major giants, so EMI, Sony, Warner, and Universal, they are the leaders worldwide, even though the catalog differs when you go to France, Germany, and so forth. So they are still the leader in France, but the artists are French. And so they've been able to do that at least for decades. What happened in terms of content, actually in the 60s, they used to translate, the Beatles, at least in countries that were not English-speaking, they would have Italian versions, French versions. That tended to disappear as English became North American, the cool language to speak. But initially, to penetrate this market, there are some rarities now where Beatles, Rolling Stones, they had like local versions of the hits. But then what would happen, probably as a result of cultivation, people try to identify as cool music coming from the UK or English-speaking countries, and that phenomenon has somewhat disappeared. What has not disappeared is that the bottom line of this industry tend to have are also artists from all over the world. And again, people are not aware of that, so they're listening to, and they are listening to other artists, but actually they're listening to the quarters games and on.
In games?
In games too. I mean, games tend to be, on the one hand, slightly outside of the Hollywood studios, even though Hollywood studios initially, for example, Warner Brothers bought Atari back then. It was like the 70s. So they understood, I mean, they know that they're no longer in the movie business, they're in the entertainment business. But there seem to be different competencies. And that too is I believe, a great example of things that are within the entertainment business, from substitutes of entertainment that are outside of the whole system. Even though Hollywood is trying to, and does so on a regular basis, especially for certain movies that lend themselves to be exploited also through games, so The Matrix, and so forth. So some action movies lend themselves, and they keep generating additional revenues for the studios. But it is true that this is another large section of the industry that is also challenged, as some of these industries are outside of the Hollywood studios.
Actually, there's some related question. So many of the Hollywood movies lately of this sort of particular large action genre seem to be based on comic books.
Right.
Have the comic books been previously distributed internationally? Because here, presumably, you have an audience that's been prepared because they've been following
Yes.
the comics. Have the comics
Yes.
also been distributed?
Yes.
Well?
Yes, for decades. And actually, they're all part. I mean, Marvel now has been bought by Disney for something like $5 million. And Warner Brothers, for example, in their assets, they have DC Comics, which is marginal in terms of revenue, but they have the character of Superman, Batman, and so forth. So in that, they are vertically integrated that way, that they can tap into its properties, and they manage this very, very well by Tarzan too. These are properties, and they start out as cartoons, but then they lend themselves wonderfully to fiction and feature exploitation. And they know that, and they've been, and since they work, they try to diminish the risks associated with the demand. They are certainly demand using sequels and prequels and so forth. But absolutely, they are part usually of the assets of these conglomerates. Yes.
In emerging entertainment industries, what have been the approaches to sort of creating, I guess, global citizens as protagonists? Like, I think for at least American entertainment,
right,
because we've been exporting it for so long, people readily identify with the central characters in our story framework, right, more than probably emerging entertainment industries. So how are they trying
What do you mean by emerging entertainment industries? Like?
Well, just because they're much more relative. Whether you go to South Korea, or whether you begin to see a lot more Chinese films imported or Bollywood films imported, like a lot of these cultures are more homogenous than the U.S. And you know, in terms of just being seen as a universal sort of lead character, like I'm sure there's probably an adjustment phase for most of us, just because we're not used to seeing it. And so I'm sure for the business side of it, they kind of probably have to do some sort of finagling if they want to make their products very, very universal, and, you know, big sort of box office smashes in multiple countries, not just importing it into America, but importing it into Europe or wherever. You know, I'm just kind of curious, in your experience, kind of how they approach building sort of these stars who appeal to.
Well, they usually, I mean, there's been production, especially in animation, from the Far East, and they tend to be regional initially, but then they found their way into major Western markets. So this has been happening for decades, and so that too, takes time. Then you get familiar with these characters, and they resonate if they indeed have some polysequent power, so they have an excess semiotic meaning, so that you can relate to them even though they are crafted somewhere else.
You would probably go to say that in terms of the focus, it's much more pull focus instead of push focus.
Well, they haven't had, I mean, when it comes to entertainment, they already have troubles having market shares in their own domestic market. As a result, competing foreign entertainment content arriving from multiple platforms. Because keep in mind that not only is this product distributed in theaters, but also to satellite channels, cable channels, and so forth. But there's been, it's usually it is referred to as ultra-flow entertainment, and there have been studies about this, where there is indeed this is indeed the case. And some of these contraflows are interesting, like former colonial powers like Brazil. Now the export from Brazil go to Portugal. Also, this is the case for some telenovelas from Mexico to Spain and Spanish-speaking countries and beyond. Russia is a great consumer of telenovelas in Spanish. And so it is happening. What has been not happening is the global dimension of these things. In other words, they tend to be regional, and very few entities, if any, have the global reach that Hollywood studios have been able to achieve in these last decades. Whereas these companies seem to be.
We're out of time.
So, delighted to talk about it. I'm here.
Fortunately, Paolo is here. Next week, another local speaker, Chris Smith, who will speak on We Have Armageddon, media, ritual, moral panic, and market meltdown.
With lunch.